Well, maybe we should leave the world of photojournalism decisions. The Bud Dwyer case also calls to mind changing standards when it comes to covering suicides. How, in your experience, how has coverage of suicides changed, over the decades that you've been involved in the news business? And where do you think we are now?
Yeah. Well, I think suicide is a very difficult question, and it's on several levels. I think that I can flatly say that it's generally not a big story. That it's tragic, but it rarely is it made a big deal over. The Dwyer case, leaving aside the question about that particular picture, certainly met all the requirements for being an exception to the rule. It was public, it involved a public official, one who had been convicted. Everything said this is outside that normal restraint about suicide. And but so unless unless a person is extraordinarily important who's passing from this earth, it needs to be noted for its news value, and unless the suicide is public or both, generally suicide is not a story much at all. And so, but the question then comes up, I don't think you should glamorize the suicide if a person stands on a building for hours, draws a crowd, and then jumps. I think you got to be very subdued about it. We don't want to have copycats. And there's a good report out by experts on how the media can help, and they are very concerned if we make the committing of suicide appear to be glamorous or a reaction to a single bad event. The example they use is boy 10 kills himself over bad grades. Their point is that nearly everybody who commits suicide has a mental illness that is either undiagnosed or untreated or both, and that they also don't think we should run a lot of details about how a suicide took place. I have no trouble accepting restraint on suicide, and there's one that I continue to debate among myself and talk with other journalists about it, is that in running a routine obituary that happens to be a suicide, do you put the cause of death in there? A lot of papers don't. And I worry about that because a lot of people know that the person shot himself, and they may figure the paper suppresses other news as well. A group of newspapers, community papers in New England years ago decided they would say cause of death and suicide. And what they found was that adhering to the wishes of the family, the medical examiner would not include the cause of death. So they were foiled by the authorities, and nobody seemed to appreciate what they're trying to do is just simply be honest. They give other causes of death, so they should give this one as well. There is no answer to that I've found that is because I know from personal experience how how traumatizing it is for a person in the family to have it in the paper, even though friends already know, but to have in the paper that their son or daughter committed suicide is makes a big difference.
But what about the argument that that not reporting suicide as cause of death kind of perpetuates the stigma in the same way that not reporting sex crimes, victims of sex crimes, perpetuates the stigma, and that conversely reporting that suicide is the cause of death promotes awareness and leads to, may prevent suicides down the road?
Yeah, well, the experts that I consulted in writing my book, they feel that we ought to write about the phenomenon of suicide, how to recognize warning signs, what to do about it if you think someone is close to you is suicidal, that we ought to write about the problem rather than about specific individuals. Again, this is caused us to kind of shift gears. It's not the usual way we think. We're focused on an event, but I think there's a lot of merit to that.
And so what about sex crimes? I know, Michael Gartner famously argues that, we should break with the tradition of withholding the names of victims of sex crimes. Geneva Overholser has made that argument as well. How do you feel about that?
Geneva's paper in Des Moines Register Tribune won a Pulitzer Prize for telling the story of a woman who had been raped. But she gave her permission. It wouldn't have been written if she hadn't given her permission. And I think there are exceptions that most of us will make, that if the person involved, the victim, wants to go public, that we would not be bothered by reporting it. We're not going to deny it. Now, if the victim is underage and the parents are not, and that comes up in a case study in the book, I think you'd have to think twice about that. The parents may not be, they're not making the decision about themselves, but about another party, and they may not be aware of the effects of publicity that we in the business might be aware of. So I think that generally speaking, though, that I'm on the side, and say so in my textbook, that while I see merit in the argument to the contrary, that I think that I would continue routinely not to run victims of sex crimes because of the stigma and because I think, as a matter of public policy, to the extent I allow myself to think about, is that it will only cause more rapes to not be reported. I think that's intuitive. You can figure that out for yourself. You don't need empirical evidence. But I certainly think we have an obligation to men accused of rape to follow their cases through and to be very clear that they've been, if they're acquitted, to make sure that gets prominently reported as well. But it is, again, it is not a perfect world, and the sex crime identification is one that has no perfect answer.
Yeah. So let's turn to Nancy Phillips and the case famously known as the reporter and the hitman. I think there's a case where my students don't seem terribly sympathetic to the idea that keeping a promise to a source who is a murderer seems all that compelling, and that this is a potentially dangerous person, and that therefore she should have gone to the cops as soon as he confessed to her. Could you provide some of the background on that case and then talk about what the issues are?
Well, Nancy Phillips, who is a very good reporter, was following the case of the bludgeoning death of a rabbi's wife in Cherry Hill. That she, like police, suspected that the rabbi may have arranged the murder of his wife, but like the police, she did not have proof of it. But for 5 years, she followed this story, and one of the people she pursued was Lynn Jenoff, who, after she had interviewed him many times, told her off the record that he and another man had committed the crime, and that they were acting at the behest of the rabbi who had paid them to do it. She just did not report it immediately to authorities. For 4.5 months, she kept this to herself. She also told her editors, which was part of our policy at the Inquirer, that she would inform the editors about off-the-record conversations that might be pertinent, and this certainly was. But in consultation with her editors, they concurred with her feeling that A, it was off the record, and B, is that Jenoff had already been shown to be a notorious habitual liar. That if she reported to police, and he then, of course, would probably deny it, and maybe police would not do anything, then she would be in jeopardy for retribution from him. She then stepped out of her role as a reporter and actively lobbied him to go to authorities. She saw that as the only way really to solve the problem. She wanted authorities to know what she had, but she didn't feel that she could tell the authorities herself. So finally he relented, and then he also allowed her to tell the whole story. And she wrote a first-person story. She was now a participant in the story she had been covered, and explained everything from A to Z that had happened. And then she and her editor decided that she would never cover that story again. And I think all those decisions were right. But a lot of people feel, though, that as you mentioned, that she should have told authorities immediately. And I think that there's the dangers that I saw in that, quite aside from the fact that we want people to continue telling us things that they may or may not want to tell the police, that we are not an arm of police. We're not opposed to what police do, but we don't think it's our job to do their work for them, and that we should report on them independently. And part of that is being seen by everyone as our own people are acting independently. And I think the public is much better off because we're able to gather information like that. But it does present a situation like that. I think that there would have been an exception if he said, I'm going to kill the rabbi or somebody. But now we have a situation where a crime is about to be committed and she has information, and I think you got to go to the police then. And I have not asked Nancy about that. I feel confident though she would agree. And I would also refer to that in legally recognized confidential relationships, like a priest or a doctor, that they would be obliged to try to head off a crime that is likely to occur, as opposed to one that's already occurred, which applied in this case.
Although, what if he had just gone ahead and killed somebody else just during those 4 months? I mean, the outcry against the newspaper would have been fierce.
Probably, although he didn't say that. I mean, he didn't say, I'm going to kill some more people. Yeah. There was no reason for her to think that he was going to kill more people.
Although, if a guy would commit a murder for hire,
maybe take another job.
Why wouldn't he do it again? Why would that? It's not like it was a crime of passion.
Well, it's a fairly complex case, but he had a long-time relationship with the rabbi, and there was no evidence that she saw that he had a similar relationship with someone else who might want him to do a crime. But that's an eventuality. Fortunately, we didn't have to face. But I would agree that that we would have got a bad press if that had happened.
Yeah. Well, you make a nice distinction in the book, I think, between values and ethical values, and that ethical values should just trump other values. And so like a value for the journalism profession is getting a scoop, beating the competition, being first with a story. And it's often the case when we screw up that the public's reaction is, well, what's the rush? It's like, tell us that progress is being made in the investigation, and if and when someone's arrested, tell us then. But why do we need to know before? I mean, it's important to you guys to beat each other. But so I think my students see it as a case where the value of getting a scoop is trumping a concern for the privacy of this individual and the damage to his reputation. And that really the public would have been happy to wait until we had something more substantial, like an arrest.
Well, I think it's a matter of degree. I think if they'd waited one more day, that most everybody would agree. Well, a lot of people know now that Jewel is a suspect, and there's not a whole lot to be gained by waiting. But I do think that what I call in the book, borrowing a term from Michael Josephson, the ethicist, of non-ethical values, not unethical, but simply non-ethical. Getting a story first, beating the competition, selling papers, are all things that if we are in this business we need to do or we don't survive. But the question is, as Josephson makes very clear, if you achieve those at the expense of violating an ethical value, such as respecting privacy, respecting and fairness and justice in the Jewell case, then it falls short. It's not a good decision. He does not even consider that an ethical dilemma. That if you analyze the values involved, which is getting a story first versus respecting justice and fairness, justice and fairness wins because it's an ethical value and this is a non-ethical. So that was a case that I would argue that I'd like to see more journalists try to think things through using the formula we talk about in the book, of stopping to think and putting yourself in a golden rule, putting yourself in Jewell's place. Do you think you're being treated fairly in this? You may not want the story about you written, but if the story is written, would you think that they treated you fairly? You had every opportunity to defend yourself and so forth. And that didn't happen, unfortunately, in the Jewell case in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
So my students are also very protective of people's privacy
Mm-hmm.
in general, and I think they think that reporters are routinely poking their noses
Mm-hmm.
where they don't belong, and they don't see what the compelling public interest is in
Mm-hmm.
knowing the details of people's private lives. And this brings us to the Arthur Ashe case,
Mm-hmm.
which I've been teaching that case for 12 years
Yeah.
now, and I still think that's really a hard one.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could talk about that one and what the issues are and where you come down on that case.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe
Yeah,
you'll convince me one way or the other at last after all this time.
I don't know if I can do that. But yeah, I included that in the book, even though it's a dated case study, because I think it's a classic.
It's a classic.
And it's, as you say, that we still battle over it. And I had an opportunity to correspond, email back and forth with two of the editors involved, Peter Pritchard, who was the editor of USA Today, and Gene Polizinski, who was AME assistant managing editor for sports, who made the decisions. And they feel that they made it very clear to Ashe that while they think it's a story, they would not republish it unless they got it on from an authoritative source. And the authoritative source would be someone in his family or his doctors. If Ashe nevertheless went public, and he may have, I mean, it's only speculation now, that he may have felt that, well, USA Today has set very high standards that I don't think my doctor or my wife are going to tell the USA Today. But the next paper, this just shows that it's now being talked about, and it's a matter of time until somebody breaks the story. So I think USA Today had certain standards that they were, for their source, and they probably would not have broken the story first, even though they wanted to. But we go back then, should we want to? Clearly it's a story everybody will read. This is a non-ethical value. That Ashe was one of the premier athletes of his time, and we teach students now who were born, I guess, since Ashe. Well, they were little, very little when Ashe was, so they don't really remember him. But they can relate to, if hypothetically, if it was somebody who's a prominent athlete today or former athlete, retired athlete, if they did the same, had AIDS, would that be a story? And they can understand, yes, that they think that is something people would be interested in. But that's just the threshold. Are people interested in reading it? That's the non-ethical value. Mm-hmm. We can give them something that they will see us as a good source, maybe come back every day for more information about whatever. And so we need to deliver stories like that. But conversely, though, is Ashe is asking for privacy. And here is a dying man who is making kind of the last request of his time on earth to live in peace and quiet and not be, not tell everybody not knowing about his illness. You remember that Ashe contracted HIV through a blood transfusion, and he got the blood transfusion before they started checking for HIV. And since they checked for HIV, there have been almost no, I'm not aware of any cases in which people have contracted HIV through the blood supply. So was there a practical reason for saying there may be problems with blood supply? That seemed to me that you lead readers down the wrong path. So it only comes down to, in my opinion, does Ash have, as a celebrity, any area of privacy? And I think he does, but I think a lot of people in my newsroom would say, "Are you crazy? This is a story. We don't, this is what we do as story." I think I would have had a hard time explaining even to other journalists because it's such clearly a story people would be interested in, and if you don't run it, you're going to be beat. But I don't think that's a good ethical argument. But I do think that if we're say we're ethical, that we ought to be in it for a time when we're going to lose good stories because we're following ethics, and not just be ethical when it is convenient to be ethical. There are benefits to being perceived as ethical, and there are also, but occasionally you're going to lose a story, and I think this is one we've lost. But I also think that it would have come out, but that does not justify. I don't rob a bank because somebody else might rob a bank, so I shouldn't run a story just because someone else might. What we talk in class is this lowering yourself to your least ethical competitor, making that your standard in this case, and that can't be defended on logical, ethical grounds. But I would not have run it, and Peter Pritchard points out, absolutely right, it seems almost quaint now that we were discussing this in the era of the internet and blogs, such as Sarah Palin's daughter being pregnant, coming out almost, a couple of days after she becomes the vice presidential nominee. That whether we like it or not, if we decide the public doesn't need to know this, we honor Arthur's request, that it'll come out a lot sooner. But I think we still owe it to our readers to try to be responsible. And in the book, there's a point of view about how the internet does these things. But if you read what you see in the blogs about Sarah Palin's daughter and what you read in newspapers and hear on broadcast and see on broadcast, there is on our side, the mainstream media, responsibility in sticking to facts and not speculating, and so there's a difference.
What about sex scandals involving politicians?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's just been one after another, this endless stream of them going back several decades, and it seems like we still don't really know how to handle them, and we still haven't decided how much is it the public's business if people are messing around outside their marriages. So where do you stand on that issue? I mean, is it the public's business? Is this Americans being overly puritanical? Every time this comes up, it's pointed out that the French know that people in public life routinely have mistresses, and nobody thinks a thing of it. That's just the way of the world, and that we're silly that we get so exercised about these kinds of things. What should the standard be when it comes to politicians who get caught with?
Well, the old standard, go back pre-Gary Hart, 1987, which was fairly easy to understand, was that it's not a story about what a person does in his private life, even though it's a public official, as long as it doesn't affect that person's public performance. So that meant that a congressman from Ohio who put his mistress on the public payroll in his office, that was a story because he abused public funds, not that he had an extramarital affair. But it also meant that we tended to overlook things like John F. Kennedy's multiple affairs while he was president. That this was ignored when, even by the old standard, it could certainly be argued it had an effect on his public performance. And of course, a couple of the people that he had affairs with, one a mobster's girlfriend and another one who possibly was an East German spy, could have been real big stories had he lived. And so, and also I think there's the fact that Larry Sabato of the University of Virginia points out that the press created a opposite image of Kennedy as the dutiful family man when in fact he was anything but. So it doesn't give us, should not give us license to draw a picture that we know is false, which is what I think happened. Although I hear from some of the people and read some of the people saying that we didn't know about Kennedy, which is kind of hard to understand, and other people who say that they were aware of it, but it was not a story. And so then we move forward to the Gary Hart case in 1987, where the Miami Herald gets a tip that a woman who turns out to be Donna Rice is flying from Florida to Washington for a tryst with the possible Democratic candidate in '88, Gary Hart. I think he was leading in the polls at the time, and they spied on him, and even stopped between editions on Saturday night for the Sunday morning paper. Put a story in there about him, this woman being in his apartment in Washington, and they didn't even know who the person was. I did not agree with that at the time, and I have trouble with it now. And I remember Gene Roberts, the editor of our paper, The Inquirer, he felt so strongly that he didn't want to run any follow-up story. But finally on Monday, where the place the Hart campaign was falling apart, did he say, well, yeah, we got to cover that?
Yeah, how could you not?
Yeah, he couldn't. Yeah. But that changed things, and of course we've had any number of stories since then. And I am back and forth on that. I think, for example, in the case of the congressman from Wilkes-Barre, who turned out to have had an affair, and the two local papers treat it in very different ways. Initially, the one paper, the Citizen's Voice, didn't cover it. The other paper, the Times Leader, did. But the Times Leader felt compelled to lead the story with Congressman denies choking woman. It's clear to me, but my speculation is that she had a falling out with him and called the police. They got there, and she just wanted it on record that they came out and found him together at his apartment in Washington on a Sunday afternoon, and then later the papers all get copies of the report anonymously. And the choking thing, she never pursued it. The police said that she didn't appear to be hurt. I see it as a red herring, but yet the paper did not feel, and I challenged our class who's studying that, why didn't they just run a story saying that police were called to his apartment and found him with this young woman in a circumstance that suggested that they were having an affair? Well, it's kind of like why the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, in my opinion, didn't say he learned, deputy sheriff, how to build a bomb that might have been used last night or this week. That you don't want to say things like that straight, but you can lead people to that conclusion. And they just ran a lot of stories at Times Leader, and ultimately the Citizen's Voice said in an effort, what I saw as having its cake and eating it too, ran a column saying, well, we know all about the congressman or the politician and his girlfriend, but we're not running it because this, and that. I mean, if you're not going to run it, you don't run it at all. Mm-hmm. But that raises questions that were dealt with by, raised again by Howard Kurtz of the Washington Post after it came out that John, the Democratic
Edwards?
John Edwards, yes, that John Edwards had an affair with a videographer on his staff, and they didn't PBS did not run a story when he confessed to ABC, which had been pursuing Edwards. Edwards finally decided to tell about it, so it was a confirmed story. But PBS did not run it. But then on Monday, after the weekend, this was Friday, after the weekend, they ran a story in which they interviewed other journalists about why they did or did not run the story. And Michael Gettler, the ombudsman for PBS, raised the question, and why didn't we cover it, and why did we then do a post-mortem? Isn't that contradictory? And their answer was, well, he was not a candidate for anything, and we think that it's not a story. Well, he was rumored as someone who would go to the convention, make a speech on behalf of Obama, and there was a lot of talk, since this is in the National Enquirer and all kinds of blogs, that Obama was going to shy away from inviting him. He clearly would have been there if it had not been for this. So Gettler then, which I quote in the book, lists about 12 reasons why it was a story, and they were all very convincing.